Welcome to Radicalize Me. I'm not very good at reading. Stay with me here. I have ADHD, and I also just found out I need reading glasses, and probably have for a long time. So when I was like preteen to young teenage, I started having an impossible time focusing on books. Recently, I got into comic books and graphic novels at the fresh young age of 32, partly because I'm writing one. Follow me on Twitter to hear when it comes out, and partly because I found that they were much easier for me to read. There are pictures, so my mind isn't overworked trying to create the scene in my head, which is a thing. But print is usually a bit bigger. You don't get so many giant blocks of text, and so on. So every night before bed, I put on my reading glasses and sit down with my little baby boy comics and have a great time. Now, something else really exciting about all this is that in addition to comics in general having a lot of socialist and anti-fascist themes, there are now a bunch of non-fiction books with the same themes written in a graphic style. This helped me introduce myself to Marxist concepts a little faster, which allows me to get through some of the denser traditional text theory books. So this has been great. I've read the Antifa comic book, a history about anti-fascist resistance over the past century or so, and there are graphic biographies about socialist historical figures. So far I've read one about Rosa Luxemburg, Eugene Debs, and I have Malcolm X on deck. But the book I want to talk about today is Marxism, a Graphic Guide. This book helped me a lot in understanding Marxism. What I feel like a lot of people don't understand is that Marx was an economist and philosopher, not just like a guy with opinions. The way some liberals and conservatives talk about him sounds like they think he was just an early shit poster or something. Now, the fact that he was an economist and philosopher is not what makes him right. He was right because he was right, but I point that out because, again, Marxist theory can be a little dense, but it is very important, so these types of graphic books are really useful. The problem is, a little less than halfway through this book, it turns into a stealth anti-Marxist propaganda piece. The book starts off fine, with a list of 10 demands from the Communist Manifesto. Solid. And this is about what you can expect for the next 65 pages or so. Brief, easy-to-understand explanations of what Marx believed, with accompanying little drawings of Marx and others quipping. But when I got to page 70, a little less than halfway through, I noticed something was amiss. Up until this point, the book had been fairly neutral. It was thorough and honest about what Marxism is, but it didn't make a judgment call in either direction. This neutrality abruptly disappeared on this page about alienation. It is important to understand the Marxian concept of alienation because, while much else of what he said has been disregarded or is now thought to be wrong, interesting because I read the past 65 pages thinking Marx's words from 150 years ago were sadly relevant to the world I live in now. But okay, maybe I'm crazy. I have to say, though, these authors love passive voice. Or should I say, passive voice is loved. No subject, of course. My first thought about this quote was, is it? Is much of what Marx said disregarded or thought to be wrong, whatever that means? Who has disregarded it or thinks it's wrong? And most importantly, why did that happen? It's not very historically materialist of them to leave that out. To be fair, the rest of that quote says, alienation is still part of modern Marxist or post-Marxist thinking. So that's sort of a clue about who disregards the rest. But let's keep going. Next, they get into Marx's theory of revolution a bit. The next page is oddly brief, but mentions Lenin, the Russian Communist Party, and how communist revolution aims to remove and remake the old system to reflect the interests of the people. After that, we have a page about what happens after the revolution. Marx himself is notoriously vague about the details of the post-revolutionary world. Again, I'll be fair here and say that as far as I'm aware, this is actually true. Marx was not a political revolutionary, So he wasn't always what you might call prescriptive in exactly how society should go about getting from capitalism to socialism, and offered no step-by-step guide in how to do a revolution. You could definitely call him a revolutionary in philosophy and economics, but he didn't lead a political revolution and didn't set out to. If the dialectic is the inevitable logic of change, then history must also continue to change, presumably beyond communism. But if the dialectic ceases, then will nothing more ever happen? Okay, this just strikes me as kind of bad faith. What is this cutesy little logic game? Wouldn't society still have to change after communism? I don't know. Yeah, probably. What, we can't talk about solving our current problems unless we can predict the rest of human history? To paraphrase a tweet I saw once that I wish I could find, how would a communist society handle the heat death of the universe? Skipping a page, we now find ourselves here. Is Marxism really scientific? Is it me or are they just wailing on Marx now? And another thing, Marx was smelly and dumb and had no friends. Well, to be fair, he probably didn't smell great, and his only friends I'm aware of are Engels and Abraham Lincoln. Society regulates the general production, and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner. And right under this, my favorite part of this book, this cow says, "Would we be happy being cared for in this haphazard way?" First of all, is it haphazard? I think Marx is just saying under communism you'd be more free to spend your time how you want to. But also, do capitalists give a shit about cow happiness all of a sudden? When did this happen that capitalists became cows' greatest allies? Continuing on, Marxist theory held out hope in a century when ordinary workers lived in the most hopeless conditions. Okay, whatever you say. But more or less all economists today believe Marx's theory seriously flawed, or to put it bluntly, wrong. I'm a little tired of bourgeois economists having high priest status while getting literally everything wrong.
Congressman, we have the highest standard of living in the world.
No, we do not. You go to Scandinavia and you will find that people have a much higher standard of living in terms of education, healthcare, and decent paying jobs.
Appeal to authority is a logical fallacy, especially when the authority constantly predicts shit that doesn't happen.
Take the minimum wage law. What you are doing is to assure that people whose skills are not sufficient to justify that kind of a wage will be unemployed.
For decades, these assholes have warned that minimum wage increases will create inflation. Meanwhile, we haven't had a federal minimum wage increase since 2009, yet inflation still increases every year. They also say that worker demands for higher wages will force employers to increasingly rely on automation, which will drastically reduce the number of jobs available. And yet, where's the automation? Why hasn't this happened? We've had robots and AI for decades, so what's the holdup, Buttercup? Well, for one thing, the bourgeois still need someone to buy their shit. Even famous non-Marxist Henry Ford knew this. If the entire capitalist class decided to automate everything and let the entire working class starve to death, what are they going to do? Just trade stocks with each other until the sun explodes? Marx also explained the automation problem as a matter of fixed versus variable capital. Basically, fixed capital refers to machines and raw material, and variable capital refers to workers. Fixed capital doesn't add value to the finished product, but variable capital does. If you completely automate the production of cars, you just get the base exchange value of the car when you sell it. If you pay wages to workers who build the cars, those wages will undercut the labor value the workers put in. That's what wages are. Think of it as getting paid for 6 hours while actually working for 10. That unpaid labor increases the exchange value of the commodity. This is Marx's theory of surplus value, and it's where profit comes from. The miracle of life. In order to keep their rate and volume of profit increasing, capitalists must maximize efficiency by reducing the number of workers they employ. This screws over the laid-off workers, in addition to the workers who kept their jobs, who now have to work even harder as the value of their wages further decreases. This is why, at least in the US, we see corporations take in record profits, but then follow them up with huge layoffs. They may claim it's because money is tight, or redundancy, or whatever the fuck, but in every case, the executives got huge bonuses with those profit increases. They're simply making a calculation as to how they can get those profits a little bit higher next quarter, too. And what's really neat is, over the past few decades, modern neoliberal trade deals allow these companies to outsource those same jobs to Mexico or China or Bangladesh or India, where they can pay workers a fraction of what they had to in the US. So now, they don't even have to give up that precious variable capital. It just becomes even more variable. Anyway, the book runs with this idea that Marxism is not actually scientific, citing philosopher Karl Popper. Popper wrote about how scientific concepts must be falsifiable, the idea being that you can't prove something unless you also know what disproving it would look like. I'm sure he wasn't the first to say this, but it was his area of study. It's also not entirely wrong, though I will get to a criticism of Popper in a minute. Popper's biggest gripe with Marxism, then, was Marx's claim that socialist revolution and the end of capitalism were inevitable. Think about it. If it's inevitable and it happens, that proves it's inevitable. But if it doesn't happen, does that prove it wasn't inevitable? Or does it just mean the inevitable thing hasn't happened yet? That's hard to answer because we can't see the future before it happens. And no, there isn't really scientific proof that this change is coming. We could look at major societal shifts that have happened throughout history to prove that all societies change, but that still doesn't tell us what change is coming or when it will happen. I will say, though, that in my experience, my fellow Marxists and I don't walk around saying revolution is inevitable all the time. Quite the opposite, in fact. We actively try to bring people around to our way of thinking so that we can move closer to the future we want. To close out this section, here's a clip of Noam Chomsky explaining the problem with Popper's essentialist attitude about falsifiability.
Popper was just describing what's common sense science since the 17th century. Scientists inquire of the world. They don't just observe it. They inquire of the world. You go back far enough, and maybe in, pre-classical Greece, maybe science looked like that. But this is just mythology. It doesn't happen, and it couldn't happen.
Next, we have The Evolution of Capitalism. This page really cements that the book is anti-Marxist propaganda in disguise. Here we learn that Marx did not anticipate that the middle classes, who he thought would be crushed out of existence by the two monolithic classes of capital and labor, would in fact grow from strength to strength. That's true. We did not see an end to the middle classes. Instead, the capitalists have managed to turn the entire working class against each other. Thanks to the introduction of the joint stock company, many people can become co-owners. Yes, at the expense of wage workers. Increasing numbers of shareholders have an interest in preserving capitalism. Yes, at the expense of wage workers. Others become managers, paid by the shareholders, who, far from joining the proletariat as Marx expected, felt superior to the class from whence they had been drawn. Right, but that's the problem. To be fair, I don't sense as much bias on this page. It sounds more like they're just explaining what happened rather than endorsing it, but I think they're leaving out some important context. The proletariat still exists, and is still the vehicle by which all of this prosperity happens. So while Marx thought the middle classes would shrink, what really happened is the petty bourgeois grew, you could say. The thing Marx actually failed to predict here is the extent to which capitalism would be able to put itself on life support. Also, it's important to note that a fucking 401k invested in joint stock companies is not a ticket to Easy Street. It's actually a pretty absurd implication to say this gives more people an interest in preserving capitalism. You're not a capitalist just because you saved up to buy 0.37 shares of Apple. Final page. Here's where they really gargle the boot. Against Marx's prediction, oh fuck, here we go again, trade unionism is not dedicated to overthrowing the system, but to improving wages and conditions. Welfare state social democracy grew powerful in the 20th century. I've heard this argument before, and it's really baffling to me. Ah, but did your precious Marx predict unions? Not so communist now, are ya? Like, dude, who do you think created the fucking unions? Communists, socialists, Marxists, coal miners literally had to go to war with their bosses, with capitalists, in order to form early unions. These people fought tooth and nail for every reform, every concession, every fucking crumb, just to make life slightly more tolerable under capitalism, and many of them, millions actually, wanted very much to overthrow capitalism. And that leads into why this analysis is so ahistorical. I want you to consider two important guys here, Eugene Debs and Vladimir Lenin. Lenin, as most people know, led the Russian Revolution and was the first leader of the Soviet Union. In 1924, Alexander Lazovsky writes in the pamphlet Lenin and the Trade Union Movement, the engine is the party. Its cogs grip the cogs of the trade union wheel and bring them into motion. The trade unions in turn set into motion the greater masses. For Lenin, the trade unions were of value only if they were imbued with the communist spirit. That the unions are made up of workers is not enough. They represent an organization of their class only if they pursue a class line, a class policy. Eugene Debs was a leader of the American Railroad Union who ran for president as a member of the Socialist Party in 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920. In those last two, he got over 900,000 votes. In 1912, that was 6% of the vote, which is more than the Green Party has ever gotten. In 1895, Debs wrote in Labor Omnia Vincit, or Labor Conquers Everything, why is it that labor does not conquer anything? Will it always be thus unmindful of its power and prerogatives? I do not think so. So it sounds like socialism and labor unions were deeply intertwined from the beginning of both of their modern forms. The misconception about labor in Marxism, a Graphic Guide, is a running theme throughout the history of revolutionary movements in the West. Revolutionaries have a set of ideas to reduce human suffering. The ruling class shuts them out of the system. The revolutionaries fight back. The ruling class crushes them as long as possible, and eventually gives in and offers concessions. These concessions are then celebrated as a testament to the wonderful achievements of liberal democracy and capitalism. Welfare state social democracy, as the book also mentions, was also won through the fights and sacrifices of socialists and communists. Social democratic policies like universal health care, tuition-free or debt-free higher education, and public housing also vary by country, and some countries, like the US, barely have any of these. And don't forget that these social democracies are still capitalist, many with their own still suffering underclasses, and have outsourced the worst of the human misery capitalism has to offer to other poorer countries. The problem with liberal philosophy is they think history just happens, or that it's just facilitated through great men. One of Marx's greatest contributions was his rejection of Hegel's idea that history is a process of constant change, inevitable progress. Marx developed the concept of dialectical materialism, basically saying that contradictions within society, like the competing interests of the working class and ruling class, create the conditions for revolutionary change, which is the true vehicle for progress. History is not linear. It is our responsibility to seek out and recognize these conditions and act accordingly to usher in the next phase of human prosperity. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you can, help us out with a Patreon subscription or one-time donation at Buy Me a Coffee. Bye now.